Dear guests, this is my conversation with Dr. David Bosold, a director of the Graduate School of North American Studies in Berlin and a specialist in Canadian politics, both foreign and domestic. He is a true friend of this podcast and also an academic supervisor to me and Vala. Throughout 2022, we tried to enrich collectively our understanding of such complex issues as the war in Ukraine and the enlargement of NATO through conversation and dialogue, offline and online. So, in today's conversation, we talk once again about geopolitics of NATO, Russian invasion of Ukraine, Western media cycle, and how people in Kremlin made the decision to go all in. If you like our podcast, please subscribe and as always, enjoy. What did you learn from 2022?
That was so general that I could come up with anything, right? For instance,
Yes.
that I shouldn't drink more coffee than I actually do, but I think that was not what you were hinting at. I guess you were talking about the political aspects, and I think that even now, 10 months into the Ukraine war, I am not really more knowledgeable is the wrong way to put it, but I mean, there are still many open questions for me. So, I mean, there are some things we addressed in earlier episodes or in earlier conversations, but if you would like my opinion sort of on global politics in general, I still think there are many sort of known unknowns, if I may
Okay. Well,
quote Donald Rumsfeld.
Okay, so what are those questions? Well, maybe we can try to disentangle them in
Well,
today's
we can try to
conversation.
disentangle them. I think we often had conversations about is that the end, or when did the so-called unipolar moment end? Are we seeing the emergence of a new multipolar system? And I think as such, this multipolar system is emerging or has been with us for the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. And American power as such is waning to a certain degree, but not as some of the critics may want to see that. But if we look at the, for instance, now change in Beijing with a complete reversal of their COVID policy, I still think that this image that was somehow or sometimes presented in Western media that autocratic regimes have certain benefits when it comes to, I don't know, pursuing a kind of policy because they don't have to get back to their citizens and there is no democratic control, they can react faster, that this would be sort of a competitive advantage. I think that's also not necessarily the case. So, I mean, as such, even if COVID doesn't sound very much like a topic, especially not the domestic kind of regulation or policy on that, like where you might look for, hey, where is the link to global politics? I still think that this, say, competition of different political systems, of different economic systems, is still something that will shape the international scene in the coming years. But for instance, when we look at important countries like India, they still have this, say, equidistance to both the United States and to China and or Russia. So I still think there are many signs that we will see some kind of new emerging multipolar system. We will also see, I think, the continuation of countries like Turkey, that is, well, not the typical NATO member state, I would say. But at the same time, now you see that Erdogan looking to get re-elected next year also, does take some decisions that, might backfire in the end. I don't know whether you followed the news about the trying to get the Istanbul mayor into prison. That's certainly politically motivated. The kind of judicial system there is certainly not one that works according to the rule of law. So, I'm not really sure whether sometimes these things that it depends how you look at it, but sometimes they're presented as being a sign of strength or a sign of weakness. I haven't fully made up my mind what I should think. In that case, I would rather go for sign of weakness, and therefore, it will be certainly to remain a very turbulent era that we're seeing.
I guess it's also good to be a little bit uncertain, because I guess in social sciences there is a trend that you have to be certain about something. Like you have to be certain why did Russia, like why Russia, like you need to be really certain why Russia invaded Ukraine or what really caused this conflict. But I think if you are uncertain, or in a sense you're searching for answers, it gives you way much more. It gives you just agility to read different sources, to just try to understand the conflict deeply and from different and multiple perspectives. So I think it's maybe a good thing, and that's I guess you will try to find answers to those questions in 2023, right?
And 24, I guess. So
yeah.
I think that will naturally continue. I just have the impression, and that's not something that not what I will say will not be terribly surprising, is that if you consume newspapers, which are now primarily done online, or you, are looking into news feeds of your social media channels, that it can also distract you in a way, because you may actually not be able to see the broader picture. And I think there is this entire mechanism about being bombarded with what is at times not really, relevant information, in the sense that it is not really changing the overall situation. I think that's something that may distract some observers. And of course, I'm affected by that as well. But I think if you were to reread some of the newspapers or newspaper articles with coverage on the Ukrainian-Russian war of March or April 2022, I think you would say, oh my gosh, this is like not very, say, profound, the analysis.
For me, it's actually like a personal issue, because there is so few resources that present information on Ukraine-Russian war neutral. Like what I mean by neutral is just like they just present facts. Like this happened, this statement was made. Russians did this and that, or like Americans did this and that in relation to the conflict. And there are like actually very few sources very few media outlets that are doing this. I found Al Jazeera is pretty good. Like in a way, because they're not with Russians, or they're not with Americans either. So they just try to present the whole picture as neutral as they can. Of course, they I guess sympathetic to maybe Western side, in a sense that, it's also hard to be pro-Russian if you're not Russian, in a sense. But I find it's one of the few. It took me a while actually to get there, because whatever like you have in the Western media, it's very biased. It's like in every article you would find such a strong language condemning Russia, even in every and there is like you could see the whole objectivity is lost, because I just want to know facts. I just want to know who did what, who launched this attack, or what type of statements did Putin make. Like in the sense of like in his own words. Like I don't want like those heavily biased language to affect my own thinking, so to speak. And it took me a while. It took me a long time during this conflict to find a source that I could, like in a sense, I could read from time to time just to get basic facts, like what's really going on. I
still think that's tricky, because of course, yeah. I wouldn't rule it out that it's possible, more or less, but I think at times you have an overlap of something like media coverage, I don't know, satellite imagery, and then at the same time some kind of interpretation. And I mean, if you are not able to separate the kind of interpretation or at times wishful thinking. So I mean, now what I found interesting, I just read the latest episode or the latest issue of The Economist, which is on the winter war, and they talk to Zelensky and they talk to the military brass of Ukraine. And I mean, what I found interesting is that they were basically saying the military brass in Ukraine. I mean, that one should never underestimate Russian manpower, what they have in terms of military equipment. And at times, if you read Western media reports, something like 2 months ago, after the Kharkiv offensive, or in that oblast, and then after Cherson, they basically said, well, I mean, it's just a matter of months maybe before Ukraine will be fully liberated. And I think that's kind of the wishful thinking. I guess, if you listen to the military observers, I always think it's better than looking at the erratic Twitter feed of a person who used to be in the military and somehow thinks that he's an expert by.
Yeah. But what I really mean is sources like BBC or Reuters, they became heavily biased, like in the sense, like.
But the question is, do you think it's on purpose or do you think it's by accident? Because I mean, at times if you look at where they get their information from. So I mean, of course, now the problem is you would need. I mean, you get all sorts of Ukrainian drone footage, maybe, that is being then made available to media outlets like the BBC. At the same time, you have very regulated access, I guess, by the Russian side. Also, I read that the BBC is no longer able to report as freely from within Russia as in earlier months. So, of course, that might also be an explanation why it doesn't work. But I mean, I agree with you that, I mean, you either seem to get the full Kremlin propaganda, or you seem to get some kind of, at least say, distorted coverage, and that is dependent, because I think that's one of the lessons you could learn even from the Iraq War back then, when they started with that concept of embedded journalism. Not that journalists are per se embedded with Ukrainian soldiers, but I mean, this kind of, sometimes they come to the front line and sometimes they are, being shipped to, or I mean, they get access to the front by certain people in the Ukrainian army. Of course, that will also shape their perception, what they write on the conflict. And I mean, that's not necessarily wrong per se. I just think that since there are multiple fronts in this conflict, and a broader strategic point, I think if you just are 48 hours in Bakhmut and do the coverage on the kind of standoff between the Ukrainian and Russian forces there, the question is it really something profound that you can write on this conflict as such?
I think I would disagree in a sense, because when you open like BBC, you are supposed to find just facts. This is what journalism is all about. It's about factual information. In other words, like Russia attacked this Ukrainian city. Like the US issued or gave Ukraine like this amount of missiles yesterday, or something like this. Just basic facts. But once they reporting, I mean, from studios and stuff, they intentionally put such a heavy language in their reporting, like soon to, like as you said, soon to lose Russia, Ukraine must win. Or in other words, they presented not as a factual information, but more as a specific media narrative. And then, of course, I feel like just desperate, because I just want facts for just my own personal consumption. Because, like, for example, before that, I enjoyed reading Reuters, because I think Reuters is more or less neutral, especially before the war. I mean, it was just factual information. This happened today. But in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, it's heavily biased, as well as CNN, as well as like BBC and other sources. Like, in a sense, for me, it's just a little bit of personal tragedy, because I trusted those sources before, but I couldn't trust them anymore, because I know, I mean, and of course, like, most of this information is still factual, but it's being like intentionally actually presented under certain like narrative. But I just still want facts.
But don't you think that's sort of a typical development that happens in any conflict, that the longer a conflict drags on between two sides, that there are some kind of narratives that emerge over time, and it's also different to change course in that sense, because I mean, of course, one important element of the media coverage in Western media, and I'm not saying this is sort of manipulated by the governments or anything like that, but I mean just something where I think there's something like not a sub argument, but some kind of sub line to that is, of course, that the media coverage also is not necessarily supposed to, but certainly should not undermine Western support, broader societal support for the Ukrainian side. So, of course, I think you have to see the broader picture and say the sanctions as such, yes, they have harmed Russia, but they also have harmed, the average household, because now you pay more for your electricity bills, you pay more for your heating, and as such, if you think, because either we don't want to see tanks rolling through Warsaw, that's sort of the image that was sometimes presented, or we don't want to, have a country being rewarded for its aggressive operation, things like that. You can pick one of those arguments. I think that's also something that started sometime in April, May. So I mean that also the support of Ukraine would be linked to the preservation of our kind of way of life, or our democratic system, etc. And I think, the more you continue like that, the more it takes on a life of its own, and therefore it's also difficult to counter that. And I think that the next month will really be crucial, because I mean, if the Ukrainians say the worst thing that they are expecting is a Russian offensive in January, and sort of the best they can hope for is the Russian offensive in March, but that the Russian offensive will happen, or now also the Moldovan side saying that they are expecting some kind of military operation starting in Transnistria, I think the Western countries or NATO countries will have to brace that. I mean, because they will see that this is, I mean, not necessarily just the beginning, but this is really a very critical time where this entire talk about, Russia is, I mean, Russian forces are collapsing, and I mean, there will be some kind of upheaval in the Kremlin, and Putin will be ousted, or the entire Russian state will collapse. I mean, this may all happen, but I mean, again, I think it might just be wishful thinking. And if it's always dangerous if you underestimate your sort of opponent, and in that sense, at least the political opponent is the current Russian regime, or how Russian conducts its foreign policy, and therefore you have to come up with a smart way to address that. And I mean, to reduce your own risk, to reduce the risks of for the Ukrainian side, and then somehow find a way how to counter that. I mean, beyond just shipping weapons and otherwise thinking that Ukrainians will retake all of the lost lands in the coming 12 months, which I think is too optimistic. Yeah, but at times it's being presented like that. So I think you need to have different scenarios. And apparently, behind closed doors, Ukrainians also see that, official Ukrainians, I mean. And of course, there's one thing where you say, oh, they should just should just accept that they lost the land. It's kind of the what many German intellectuals, cited in open letters. I mean, that's also at least problematic, to say the least. But I mean, the sort of other extreme to say, hey, we just, otherwise do whatever it takes to paraphrase Draghi by putting all our military weight into the conflict. I mean, the question is, if you do that, you need to have some kind of idea of what you want to achieve. And I mean, if you have that, and if that also is in line with what the Ukrainians want, or the Ukrainian government wants, okay, that you could consider that. But I think as such, you really have this fog of war thing where you have
But
strange narratives of the war
But
and the coverage that is not really transparent or not.
ambiguity, so to
Yes,
speak.
yeah.
I mean, it's especially specific created on both Russian and Ukrainian and American ends, because whenever you go to Russian, Ukrainian, or American officials, they're very ambiguous in terms of like what is the end goal of this conflict. But you could see they all, in a sense, embrace the longer conflict. I mean, Russians definitely understand that the conflict will last for a while, maybe for 10 years, maybe for 5 years, who knows. But I think they're up they're up for a bigger conflict just in case, but they're also up for a longer protracted conflict with Ukraine. Then, of course, Ukraine must also understand that they probably will face Russian aggression for a while, and in a sense, Americans also prepare for a longer conflict. And like once you start thinking about, but what's the really end goal? Like what are they fighting for? And to me, it was really surprising. The more you come back to this idea of Ukraine in NATO, or just if you answer positively that Ukraine becomes NATO, you end up in one world scenario, like where NATO wins, or like in a sense, Americans win in this conflict, and Ukraine becomes part of NATO, probably maybe with the help of Russian collapse of Russian government or something like this. Maybe something else happens. Like who knows? But this gives you one picture. Or we end up in a situation where Ukraine doesn't become part of NATO, and this is, of course, the picture is like in a sense what Russia is fighting for. But of course, like now, it's really even hard to find those clear statements. But I think like the whole concept is just, in a sense, the whole concept of like Ukraine being either part of NATO or not is there. Like in a sense, it gives you at least, if you can try to understand this conflict, if you want to understand the future of this conflict, you should think about those terms, or you should think about those concepts, because whatever resolution they have eventually, Ukraine and Russia, part of membership in NATO would be there. But it's also interesting in the sense that for Russia, like in a sense, Russia must ensure that Ukraine won't become part of NATO. And I think this is a tricky question, because you could imagine a type of scenario where Ukrainian authorities say, hey, take those lands, but let us be part of NATO and European Union. And I think Russians would say no. I mean, we will continue this conflict forever. If we need to continue this conflict until I don't know, complete collapse of Ukrainian state, I guess we would do this. And I guess this is something that, of course, it's very destructive Russian behavior, but it's destructive for a certain specific reason. But I also wanted to elaborate what you said about the Russian demise, or in the sense that you said that Russia is not like that powerful, or the narrative that is circulating in Western media. And of course, I thought about it quite a lot, and they try to portray Russia as a weak state for a while, and they're still in the business of doing this. They're saying, Russia has a economy size of Italy. It's not their great power, and whatever documents you have now from American side, in all documents they're saying like, the big threat is like China, but Russia is like, it's a destructive power. They're calling it, I guess now officially in strategic documents or something like this. So in other words, they want to kind of like specifically, like in a sense, almost like a human perspective, offend Russia. And this is, I thought about it, but this is like one of the reasons Russians started the whole thing, because they want to show the world that like Russia still matters. I mean, at least from Putin perspective, definitely. Russia is still can do a lot. You shouldn't underestimate.
Some people might say it's close to suicidal approach, but I mean, but that there is I think we can agree that there is a strong psychological element to that, and one of humiliation or a feeling of humiliation or a feeling of superiority on one side and that on the other. But I think I think what you raised in terms of aspects, that there is something like an unintended escalation of the conflict, because eventually it could boil down to the question, does Ukraine, in whatever kind of territorial shape, because there might be some kind of parts that wouldn't continue to remain in Ukraine if it becomes a part of NATO, that as such, I think that's a very, say, German perspective or Eurocentric perspective, because I think for the American side, we are now seeing a kind of hodgepodge of different narratives that are linked to the Ukraine war. And one is always something that you find in American media, but that you find not that often in European media, and that is that this entire support of Ukraine and the kind of conflict between different systems, between Russia and NATO countries, is also one that signals, or is supposed to signal, something to the Chinese side, and is also something that is sort of being interwoven with the Taiwan question. So I mean, in that sense, the entire repercussions of the conflict, or what other countries should learn from this narrative of the West is united, NATO is united. Yeah. We're doing everything we can to support Ukraine. We're everything to uphold international law, the rule of law, etc. I think all of that is also supposed to be communicated to a broader global audience, at least from an American perspective. And I think in Europe, especially in Germany, the discussion seems to be very much more geographically limited to the European landmass, or to Europe as such. And I think there is not that one perspective is right and the other one is wrong. It's just, if you do have this more global outlook, I think there are way more aspects you have to bear in mind. I mean, that's what I mean from the side of Washington. But there is also, I think, a different kind of thinking of different options. And I think I could imagine that in the United States, or in Washington, policymakers are perhaps thinking that Ukraine could become a member of NATO. But I mean that whereas Western Germany used to be kind of the front state of the Iron Curtain, then that this would then be Ukraine would become the kind of front state to, I don't know, whatever kind of Shanghai Cooperation Organization alliance emerges. Or I mean, now we just saw Putin and Lukashenko basically reaffirming their commitment to a kind of joint defensive posture. So I think as such, you're seeing a hardening of the positions. And it's something that we discussed in an earlier talk or discussion we had, whether there is something like a new, say, Cold War, where we really have very clear and rather not very porous frontiers or borders, such as in the Cold War, or whether we see some other outcome. And I don't see the other outcome as very plausible at the moment.
That's I guess what we try to understand collectively. And but I don't really like, I mean, for me it's like a red flag, like New Cold War, because it's a very lazy historical analysis. Because Cold War was a very, like, of course it was a bipolar world if you think about this grand geopolitical terms, but it was also like both USSR and the US, they wanted to preserve, there was a status quo after the World War II. And this status quo was very stable, especially on the European continent. Of course, you can also think that European continent is the source of all world wars. And like the rules of the game were pretty clear, and no one wanted to get into the territory of another power. I mean, there was certainly like status quo. There was an order, or there was an agreement. But now there is really no order. Like, in a way, like a lot of like analysts use this term disorder, like something like even Zeitenwende, something is changing. And that's why I guess, of course, it makes it way much more dangerous. And of course, you don't. Yeah, I would say like dangerous, and the world is still globalized. Like in a sense, it's not really divided because people in Moscow still, and people in, I would also assume in Shanghai, they still live in this type of consumer society. Nothing. There is no other ideology, so to speak. There's only one ideology. This ideology of consumerism. I mean, one can argue about different type of political systems, but they're all like, they still resemble one another. And of course, it makes it very interesting. And in a sense, that's why I don't really think it's a Cold War. There is no really ideological basis. And second, there is also...
I agree that there's no... I mean, what I meant with my reference to Cold War is it's less an ideological one, but one where you have clearly demarcated borders, where you have, 1,000 tanks on one side and on the other. So, I mean, you basically have a stalemate that doesn't make it... that doesn't give any incentive to try to change the territorial status quo. And I mean, it's something like a deep freeze, or it's a bit something like the Russian occupations, or what they called peace forces in some of the former USSR territories, like Transnistria, Abkhazia, those places where you, or some parts in Central Asia, or Nagorno-Karabakh, where they also technically froze the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, I mean, it could be something like that. Of course, that's not a permanent solution, but I mean, the question is, otherwise, will we see a continuation of the war? I don't know. Again, there is something else where you have this analogy. There are two comments I would like to make. One is this idea whether we now live in a Zeitenwende world or in a more turbulent era. I think it's something that many people who have lived through the Balkan Wars find terribly disturbing, because I mean it continues that narrative that between 1990 and 2022, or maybe 2014, before Crimea was invaded, we lived in this terribly peaceful world, and then people forget the Iraq War, people forget the Yemen War, people forget Afghanistan. People forget, not least the Balkan Wars. I mean, that's also why I think it was a slap in the face for the people to say, that's the first large, conflict or war in Europe since the Second World War, which is simply not correct. So I think there is this kind of glossing over of historical events, or trying to characterize a period, the last 30 years, that actually was not as it is now sort of being portrayed. And the second thing, to the Cold War aspect, I think also there, this seeming stability also wasn't really there. If you look at the kind of policy that Tito and the Yugoslavs or Yugoslavia had, because I mean, as such, Tito was smart in that sense in doing that balancing, but as such, this was clearly the entire non-aligned movements, decolonization, etc. They also brought some kind of momentum, and you could see the proxy wars then developing. So I mean, in that sense, what was frozen was the European map, with the exception of the Balkans, and otherwise the globe. I mean, you had so many conflicts that where the Soviet Union was involved, where the Americans were involved, or Western countries were involved. So I think as such, it's also almost a cliche to say, the Cold War, that was when we had this ideological rivalry and everything was, the status quo seeking stuff. That's all correct for Europe. And I think in that sense, it's, for me as a German, it sounds terribly plausible, because that's how, I was taught history. This is, then we went, and of course I lived through the times back then and saw the inner German border. But I mean, it wasn't as rosy as, they sometimes try to tell us now, I think.
But I guess Europe is the source of great wars, the wars that really disrupt normal way of life, and that's why I think it's hard to it's a little bit hard to imagine that we are going to live through the second year with this war ongoing, because of course, I guess it's true to say that the more this conflict goes on, like the more chances of escalation we have. So and escalation can happen in so many different directions because of course this type of escalation is not under anyone's control, neither under Putin's, neither under people in Washington. And of course you have a full scale, as people in the West like to say, full scale war ongoing with with this bigger geopolitical context and conflict and context, and the context is the West vis-a-vis Russia, so to speak, and of course,
or the US versus China, or the West versus the autocratic rest of the world.
Yeah,
depending on what narrative you sort of take into consideration,
yeah.
apply into.
But it's also, I wanted to mention that, of course, from the American perspective, they really like this concept of new Cold War, because, I mean, from their perspective, well, they won the Cold War, they're still pretty powerful, and they could win the second Cold War. Of course, I don't think it's they do intentionally think so, but of course, subconsciously they should think so, because they won the Cold War, and the Cold War was way much more serious conflict because of the ideological substance. And now there is really no ideological substance. There is just like this war, as they say, against autocrats of the world, but they could still muddle through it and they can make it. I mean, in a sense, people in Washington, they do like geopolitical games, so to speak. And of course, for them, I think so. I mean, I don't know whether they really do, but that's what I think. And from their perspective, of course, the narrative of the new Cold War is a good one, because I mean, they think they probably can win the second Cold War, and as such, again, the competition between China and the US is pretty serious for them, but the competition between the US and Russia is not that serious enough, which, again, as what we discussed in terms of psychological perspective and from Russian perspective, the whole thing is actually like it makes it way much more complicated, because you do have this power that is really dissatisfied and that is really desperate, and in a sense it feels that it's being kind of suppressed and pressed, like intentionally suppressed, and which future is, in a sense, very opaque.
How can we disentangle that? I mean, because if you now take, again, sort of, it's almost a straw man thing, right? What we have been talking about, this sort of Western media thing. Of course, it's a little bit more complex, but I mean, what I think we both mean is, if you look into a European quality newspaper, or into public broadcasting stuff like the BBC or German public broadcasting, you more or less have a consistent narrative of the current conflict, and you have interpretations or arguments like, this is sort of the neo-imperialism of Russia, and it has all been with us. It's something that has been prepared. It's a way it's an amalgam of how the Russian Orthodox Church also has been integrated into the wider political system of the Kremlin. Everything after 2008 has, been that the money that was earned by exporting energy has been primarily invested into military equipment and into enlarging the military. So I mean, you can say, well, of course, this is correct, or it's partly correct, or it's mostly correct, whatever. What I don't get is that when you seem to listen to Russian intellectuals who are still sort of pro-Kremlin, you have this sense of that the West, whatever that is, or NATO, or the US, or like all the other countries, they didn't treat Russia correctly. They sort of cheated on Russia. They don't talk to it at the same eye level. So a lot of it sounds a bit like, small children in the playground, I mean, trying to negotiate who is sort of the top dog, who otherwise, that they are sort of respected. And at the same time, we have this sort of Western media narrative that it's all pretty much a clear ideological plan by the Russian side. and they will, they have to be stopped, and the only way to stop them is by, bringing everything that we have to the table when it comes to military equipment. And my guess would be both are not fully off, but it also doesn't lead to a picture that as such is convincing. So I think, of course, there is this kind of neo-imperial ideology, and it's certainly related to the Kremlin's propaganda. But what is the driving force? Is it just that, if we say, hey, we respect you, and we know that you're a great power, and Obama was wrong that he called you a regional power, is that something that will really change policies in the Kremlin? I don't think so. But at the same time, is this idea to, hey, we just put more HIMARS and other stuff to the Ukrainian side, will that, eventually make the Russians say, hey, now we're really outnumbered, we rather withdraw back to the pre-February 24 borders? I think both sounds not terribly convincing, or rather naive to me.
Well, I can maybe clarify the Russian thinking. In a sense, I think it's just deeply anti-American, and anti-American in the sense they don't want the US to be just the sole authority in European security architecture. Specifically security architecture, because you can go again, like Russian position is very consistent. It's like actually incredibly. If you just go through Putin's speeches all the way to 2001 in Bundestag, to 2007 Munich Security Conference, to 2015 in the UN, just you listen to these three speeches and you could see how his narrative developed. In 2001 he said we should drop this whole division into the West and non-West, and he said like the world has become way much more complicated than that, which is true. Of course the whole West non-West division is false, is intentionally designed to categorize nations into these convenient baskets. But of course, like even we're now in Berlin, and we all understand that the world is way much more complicated than all those banal categories of like World War II, or Cold War and World War II in a sense as well. So the Russian narrative is just that they don't want Americans to be the sole authority in specifically European security architecture, because they don't really consider themselves like a world power anymore. Of course, they have certain ambitions, but I don't think they really think about themselves as something that could really challenge American.
But why do you think that? When was the point in the Kremlin, by Putin, by other Russian decision makers, that they thought, well, with the Normandy format, we saw that the only Europeans who are still rather tilting towards the Russian position, or those who are more accommodating and sort of trying to balance between the Russian and the American position. This was like France and Germany, right? How come that they eventually thought, well, we just go all in? Because I think that is something that we also discussed repeatedly, and I still think that's a correct observation, is that the Ukraine war really led or really forced countries, maybe with the exception of Hungary to a certain extent, to really say, we're either with the Russians or we are with the US, or US and Ukraine. It's a bit like this George W. Bush thing, when he in the State of the Union said, the axis of evil, and also you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. This kind of black and white thing, this is now really something obvious, and you see that with every newspaper article that appears on either Emmanuel Macron or Olaf Scholz talking to Putin on the phone, and what is then made up what the content of this conversation was about. Oh, the war won't end soon. Well, okay, terrible, but that's also not terribly surprising. But other than that, my guess is that the Americans are trying to also, certainly supported the Germans and the French to, keep that channel of communication open. But other than that, I think when it comes to finding some kind of agreement, it seems to be that they are all now really in this kind of bifurcated world, we have the West against
But
Russia.
it's also, if you think about American perspective, no one gives up like this world dominance. Like no one. I would say no one would want to say, I have all the power in the system and now I give up this power. I mean, of course, maybe some people could argue that happened with Brits and Americans in 20th century, but of course, from perspective of Brits, Americans were almost identical to Great Britain, and they reserved a lot of power for Great Britain, which is still a powerful nation despite its size and the size of its economy and stuff like this. I mean, of course, it's also an interesting question. How when did in Kremlin they decide to go all in? And I thought about it quite a while. I think actually the whole Russian position, you can say structural position pre-war was actually weak. Russia didn't go anywhere, to be honest, because it was intentionally put by Western powers into the sanctioned status quo. There was no hope to resolve Ukrainian conflict, and again, probably in 20 years, as Putin said, Ukraine would join NATO. So what we're going to do about this? In a sense, and of course, the Russian economy didn't perform great either. So, of course, there was this moment when, and I guess I'll also bring Russian domestic perspective into this picture, because for Putin, it's important to preserve whatever he created during this 20 period of time. And what he created is this idea of sovereign, independent nation. Maybe it's not that great economically, but at least it's sovereign. It has a right to decide its own kind of historical path. And its path is basically confrontational with the West. It challenges, I think it challenges American authority. It doesn't challenge the West itself. I think it's still willing to cooperate with Germany or France. But
it has done that in other parts, right? I mean, you could see that in Libya, you could see it in Syria, you can see it in Mali or in other countries in Africa. I mean, you could. I guess people in Washington will say, well, we all saw that, but why the heck did they decide then to invade Ukraine? It already was a pain in the ass for us in Syria, in Libya, in other parts in the Middle East, in Africa. But why are they now? Even opening up a new front.
I think I can give you two answers. And one would be a structural one, because the war changes all dispositions and positions in the game. Suddenly, something big happened, something that would go into history, and this creates some window of opportunity actually for Russia, because future is really uncertain. Because again, pre-war scenario for Russia is not really the great one. Okay. You think about the European Union would grow economically, the US would grow economically, China would grow economically, Russia wouldn't probably grow economically pre-World War. Pre-war in Ukraine. It probably wouldn't grow now either, but at least it retained this kind of sovereignty and authority. This is, I guess, from structural perspective, its position in the system wasn't that great, and at least. The war opens this new chapter in history, and who knows where it leads us. I guess the second point I want to make, it would be, if you think about Putin as an artist, actually. I know it's
hard to imagine.
I think he is a great artist, because if you think about artist, again, connecting to the first point, whose canvas is world history. And of course, what artist wants is attention. And if you think about he opened this new chapter in history, which is a pretty big statement, because whoever people will remember in 100, 200, 300, even 1,000 years probably would be Putin from this period of time. It's a pretty big statement to make, in a sense. Of course, it's a little bit suicidal. It's very risky, but everyone is talking about Putin. Putin is still on all the headlines. This is again when you go through Economist, pale of your Economist journal, so to speak, you could see no one thought about Russia in 2021, a little bit maybe, but suddenly exploded. Everyone talks about Russia, and this is also, of course, deeply psychological in psyche of Russian people, that Russian people do enjoy this attention. I mean, in a sense, they do want to be Americans. Like they do want to have certain, yeah, I would say just attention. So people talking about you, people discussing you, and you might think it was very important for Russians to create a new type of a country in 20th century. It was important for them to launch people in space. All those things, of course, it's all about attention and, in a sense, just respect. Just like it's something like
back to respect.
Yeah, but also and also the third point, it's of course like just Russian domestic maybe politics, because Putin wants to save whatever he created during this 20 period of time, and the way he could ensure it is just creating this conflict, because like Russia would never. I mean, like now basically whoever comes into power after Putin, he will have to deal with this conflict on Putin's terms, because there is no way back. And of course, from Russian perspective, there is also a deeply seated, I would say maybe deeply seated confrontation with the Ukrainians. So there is no way you can come back. There is no way that whoever comes in Kremlin after Putin, his successor, he will cede territory to Ukrainians, and he will strike a peace deal with the U.S., for example. So there is this type of like conservation of the Russian political system, and like in a way, it's a way to ensure that the country will go into the same direction that he chose, so to speak. So I would think those, I guess, like summary of over this year of observation, so to speak. So what do you think about it? in a sense, does it sound appealing?
It certainly doesn't sound appealing. Whether it sounds convincing or plausible is a different story. I mean, we've had this phenomenon of the, Kremnologists, or however you pronounce them, right? In the 1980s, so when there was, or 70s, when it was unclear what is actually happening in Moscow, who's calling the shots. I mean, how are decisions being taken and prepared and what have you? And I think in that sense, maybe less so Washington, but I mean, still Moscow, I think, for the respective other side, is still something like a black box. I think that as such, the understanding of Washington, what Americans want, is most likely a little bit better in Moscow or in the Kremlin than the other way around. But as such, I still think that both sides don't really understand what the other side wants, and therefore also presents or interprets, analyzes the conflict to the domestic audience on their own terms, or like there is something like of course, a Russian narrative of the entire thing that is being presented to the Russian population, and there is something similar. How the American government is presenting the Ukraine war to the American public, and that is, I think something that is pretty much based on the interpretation of the conflict by the Americans, and less so on an attempt to, what is it that the Russians really want. Something that I think scares me, or something that I'm afraid that might happen, and that might really escalate the conflict in a way that we haven't expected, is really the different options by the Russian side to escalate the conflict, not on the territory of Ukraine, but I mean, if you think about what they could potentially do in the Caucasus, or rather in maybe Georgia or Armenia, Azerbaijan. Of course, that could also backfire. I mean, there is still something where Russians could escalate the situation there, and they could also, I think, maybe escalate the conflict with regard to Kazakhstan, and not least with regard to Moldova. I mean, I found it interesting to say that, based just on the media reports I read, whether they are good, I don't know. But if really the Moldovan intelligence, which sounds maybe awkward for some people, right? Because they always look down upon Moldova as this kind of strange state in Europe. But I mean, if the Kremlin or if Russia is opening up a second front there, I think this would really also mean that this war or conflict between the West and Russia will be one of many years. And I think that where Western observers really have underestimated the Russian side is that apparently neither is the population in Russia revolting against the Kremlin policies to the extent that some observers thought they might, nor is the Russian state actually weakening or collapsing as easily as some observers wanted to or foresaw it. So I as such, I think they, even if they on average are in a weaker position, I think that the kind of, not momentum, but I mean the kind of possibility to freeze up some resources or really to go to the very core of the survival of the state with, for instance, the mobilization decision is something where I think we see differences of Russia versus other countries. I mean, if you just see that they can mobilize 300,000, maybe even 1 million people. I mean, it's not something that, I mean, you could do in the same proportions in Germany, for instance. The same goes for the military equipment. So I mean, also the reports I read are very contradictory, but because at the same time, it's being said that Russians are running out of ammunition. The same goes for the Ukrainian side. Then I read something like that the entire approval of HIMARS ammunition that is sort of being promised to Ukraine is something that the Ukrainians have actually used in, I think, 5 to 6 months. But now it takes something like 4 years of full production to replenish them. As I mean, I think as such the very strange situation, and there I really miss kind of military expertise or a talk or information by a military expert, is there really seems to be a breaking point now that with regard to the so-called sophisticated weaponry, both sides actually seem to be weakening or running out of stock. And of course that will be something, if it's just to, infantry and some tanks and some rifles and machine guns, how will this conflict actually turn out? Because apparently this precision-guided missiles from the West and from Russia no longer seem to be in stock to a large extent, and they cannot be produced as quickly. That the war as such can continue as it was being fought this year. So I'm not sure whether I should see that as a positive sign, so that, this makes negotiations more likely and an end of the conflict, or is it just suggesting, oh my God, this conflict is getting even worse and even more people are killed? It's something I cannot really answer because I lack the necessary expertise and insights. But I mean, apparently both sides or both options seem to be on the table.
Like, returning back to our discussion about media, it may be actually just wishful thinking, because I also read people like some military analysts, even in America, they're saying Russia has been, like Russia and Soviet Union especially, has been preparing for a larger Cold War style conflict with the West. So in terms of stock, they have stocks in a sense. I mean, it's also maybe wishful thinking that they try to say, just let's support Ukraine. I mean, again, it comes to this narrative. Let's increase our support of Ukrainian army, and then Ukraine wins, and then we'll go home. But in a sense, I think Russia is ready for very protracted, longer conflict. And of course, as you said, like the chances of escalation are very high, and it's also they could escalate in Baltics. They could escalate. Like by attacking just other NATO member, because I mean they could say, well, if they like NATO is the part of the conflict, and I mean of course NATO is already part of the conflict, so to speak. That makes the whole conflict very, of course, dangerous and prone to escalation. Okay, that doesn't sound like a.
It doesn't sound like the rosy outlook for 2023. You mean? But
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
that's something that we have to continue to discuss in early 2023, and maybe some political developments until then are, making us come to a more optimistic assessment. But I mean, you're right. I mean, we have Moldova, we have the Baltics, we have maybe less so the Balkans, where there was always this debate about the role of Serbia, for instance. But as such, I think that this idea that it will suffice to just send more weapons, and I mean, there is no way that short of the nuclear option that the Russians have to escalate. I think that was also again wishful thinking in the West. So I mean, one has to see what can be done. But I think
Otherwise, it's a pretty grim.
it's unfortunately still a grim picture. But I mean, I still remain an optimist in a way. So I hope we'll be able to discuss better news next year.
And it's good that you are uncertain, because I am uncertain as well. So at least, I guess like uncertainty gives you way much more room for exploration
and optimism.
I mean, I'm not sure about optimism, but critical thinking definitely. And I guess like we are living through history now, in a sense. If you think about Putin as an artist who like draws on the history as a canvas, like, people will write about him quite a lot of books, even in 200 years.
Well, people always wrote about lunatics, right? So that's right. And
I mean,
there were others as well.
I mean, yes. So let's see how it unfolds. So thank you very much, and look forward to our conversations in 2023.